QSO Today, episode 534, Cory Sickles, WA3UVV. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSOtoday.com webpage. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio? Do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. Jim Heath, W6LG, a popular amateur radio YouTuber and my guest in episode 320, passed away in December after a long illness. Jim used YouTube for many years to instruct on all aspects of the amateur radio hobby, and I got to know him after our September of 2020 QSO Today interview. Jim will be missed. May his memory be for a blessing. As the technology world is becoming increasingly more AI-driven, I'm attempting to prune the hosted services that I purchased and used to create this podcast and the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo. I was afraid that if I were to create future expos, that I would need all of these services just to do it again. Working with AI now has convinced me that I can easily and quickly recreate just about anything in minutes without a team of full-stack developers. My pruning did break some of the systems around the archive of the expo videos. I was contacted by listeners who told me that what was broken, and I have since fixed access to these videos. Try the links on the show notes pages now. Please contact me if you run into any problems, and I'll fix them quickly. Cory Sickles, WA3UVV, first licensed in 1973, explores radio from the inside out, including homebrew transmitters, vintage gear, and cutting-edge digital modes that he highlights in his monthly Spectrum Monitor magazine column, Digitally Speaking. Cory was a bleeding-edge pioneer in desktop computing and applications for specialized business segments. He is a passionate club builder and mentor, helping grow one of the most active and welcoming amateur radio clubs in western Pennsylvania, while serving the AWL in key outreach and coordination roles. WA3UVV believes that strong clubs, digital innovation, and human connection are the future of amateur radio, and is my guest in this QSO Today. WA3UVV, this is Eric 4Z1UG. Are you there, Cory?
WA3UVV, good morning.
Good morning, Cory. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
We have to go back from, I became a ham in my teens, but we have to go back before that to a time when I was 3 years old. And it was kind of hot in the apartment I was growing up in at that time. We had a set of window fans, and I had seen my mother plug them in the past, and I thought, well, I can do that. And I grabbed on to the plug, and my little 3-year-old fingers actually made contact with the prongs. So while I was doing that, I was suddenly introduced to the concept of electricity. My grandfather, who was an engineer for Rockwell, visited us that evening, and one said, don't do that again. And two, this is electricity. And I had questions, and he could see the curiosity. And he started doing little experiments, cloth on a fluorescent tube in the dark, and, electrons discharging magnetic stuff and things. And he then got me some kits at the local hobby shop from Philips. So I learned that color could be spelled with a U, and another, English words, not Americanized words. Built that kit, got another one, that sort of thing. By the time I was in first grade, by virtual electronics, I was spelling words like self-oscillation, resonance, reactance, things like that, while the other kids were, C-Jane run, that sort of stuff. My sister was also a teacher. We had a 20-year difference between us, and she helped with my education a lot. But, I really got the chance to experiment as long as my mother was convinced that I would not electrocute myself with a 9-volt battery. She had some worries since that was, in fact, my introduction into electronics. One day, I went to the Penn State Dairy, which was a little convenience store in my neighborhood, and with the intention of getting some candy. And I just happened to take a look at the newsstand, and I saw this publication called Electronics Illustrated, and that's where my candy money went to. And every month I would show up at about the appropriate time that I expected a new issue to arrive and buy that. And then there was Popular Electronics and other things that came through with all of that. Fast forward into junior high, I had an English teacher, very old, cranky lady, but she had an obsession about sirens. So we had a fire department or fire headquarters, not too far away station. And whenever she heard the siren go off, she would waddle over to the window where I sat and peek out the window back and forth looking for the fire apparatus, EMS, police car, whatever she was hearing. And she would completely stop the class to do this. And one day, because I did like to play practical jokes on people, I happened to be at a place called Fayette Radio Electronics, one of two stores, very pre-Radio Shack coming to town, where you could buy electronic parts, and I was a regular. And I saw this ICO siren kit for $6.95. And the light went off, and I said, I'm going to have some fun with this. So I went home, built it. The next gym day, when we could go around with our gym bags, I had that, and I had a little push button sticking outside of the gym bag. I had the speaker attenuated somewhat. And when she was on the other side of the classroom, I hit the button. Class stopped. She waddles over to the window, back and forth. Of course, she didn't see anything. Frustration. I did this 2 more times in class. Thankfully, none of the other kids ratted me out. My next class was algebra, and everybody was still chattering about that. And my algebra teacher was kind of cool, younger guy. And he said, Cory, what did you do? And I showed him. And being that I was a straight A student, I got away with a lot. He laughed. He said, I shouldn't laugh, but it's funny. And you're going to get yourself in trouble. Well, about a week later, he brings in the projector and shows a film called Ham's Wide World. Now, at this point, I had heard of amateur radio. I'd read about amateur radio. I had a shortwave receiver. But it really hadn't clicked as to what ham radio was. And this was the moment where it did. So I have to thank the league for producing that film, and I have to thank my algebra teacher for showing it. The issue then for me was finding other hams. And some time went by before there was notice in the newspaper that the local radio club, just sitting outside of town, was having an open house. And, I wanted to go. I was 14 years old, couldn't drive myself, and it was too far for a bike ride. So I finally convinced my parents that, we should go to this thing. And I people talk about their Elmers. I had a Greek chorus of Elmers. I had, one person that convinced my mother, no, we'll make sure he doesn't electrocute himself. He's going to have fun with this. He's going to learn a lot. It's very educational. And what he did for me was pick me up. Every night there was activity at the club, take me out and bring me home. There was another guy that is there still today, close to my age. He was probably at that time, and certainly is now, a caretaker of our club and a driving force for a vintage radio museum that I've written about, and is also something you can find on our website, W3PIE.org. Shameless self-promotion. Somebody else taught me Morse code. Theory, I was pretty good at. In fact, I taught a portion of my own novice class theory. But rules and regs, I had to learn those. And this was a time when we didn't have the license guides with all the multiple choice questions and things like that. They were more open-ended questions in the study guide, like how would you attenuate key clicks in a CW transmitter? Things like that. So, but the rules and regs, frequency bands, things like that I had to learn. So got my novice, and that was 1973 when I was first licensed.
Why do you think your algebra teacher showed you that film, or showed the class that film? That seems kind of like way off the topic.
Well, it was, except that every once in a while we would get ahead of the lesson plan, and we got rewarded with a 16 millimeter film. So some of these things were how salt was mined. Oh, Walter Cronkite did a series for Union Carbide, the 21st century. Most of those predictions are wrong.
And then there was the Bell Telephone. What was it? The Bell Telephone series of scientific films. I remember in those days.
Yeah, those were excellently produced. Everything from what blood is composed of to how to move data, speeds, things like that. I mean, this was all very.
Well, do you think Ham's Wide World was a film that the school might have just had in there?
They had some sort of a library they ordered from. And I think, honestly, a week turnaround was kind of quick. So he probably interrupted some other film that he had intended to show next.
Was he a ham?
No. And as far as I know, he didn't have much interest in electronics, but he was one of those teachers that stands out because he really did care and had a concern about his students. And I think I was fortunate enough to have him as a teacher, in that moment.
And what was the hometown?
Uniontown, one word, Pennsylvania. And it was formed on July 4th, 1776.
And is that where you are now? Are you still in the area?
Yes. I grew up here. I moved away in late 79 and lived in New Jersey, both the north and southern parts of the state, until about 10, 11 years ago, and moved back to my hometown.
So you got your novice license in 1973. That was, I think, the same year I got my novice license, as a matter of fact. And so what happened from there?
Well, Radio Shack at that time was selling a set of 4 league books, an Introduction to Morse Code, the Study Guide, I forget the other titles now. But one of them was, all about electronics, and it had several articles pulled from QST. And one of them was from a gentleman by the name of Lou McCoy. And he had a 60-watt transmitter set of plans that were in that one of those books. And essentially, you could build that from an old TV set and some extra parts. One of the members in the radio club turned out to be a ham, of course he was a ham, but he was the owner of a TV repair shop. And he knew I was interested in electronics and ham radio. And he called me one day and he said, "Do you happen to have a little red wagon?" And I said, "Yeah, I haven't played with it in years." He said, "Well, bring it down. I have something for you." And long story short, I came home with a couple of TV chassis. And out of that, I was building the Lou McCoy 60-watt. But I was still probably a month from getting around to finishing it when I was talking to a neighbor from 3 blocks away who was also a ham, closer to my age. And he had a DX20 that he was willing to get rid of with a couple of crystals. So I went over, picked that up, brought it home, and was on the air that afternoon. My receiver was a DX150 from Radio Shack, which my parents had gotten me for Christmas. And that's, in a center-fed dipole, is what put me on the air. And the fun kind of started from there. I'm still very grateful to a ham in Texas that was very patient with all of the mistakes I was making, being nervous with my first QSO. But I did make it through at 5 words per minute, which seemed fast at the time and is now pathetically slow.
It seems to me that somebody with this interest in electronics and a natural affinity towards it would pursue electronics in a career. So how did it go after high school? Is this the direction that you went?
It is, although in a kind of an odd way. About the same time that I got into amateur radio, another revolution began with microprocessors. There were a couple of articles that came out, and I'm blanking on the magazines, but radio electronics was the first one. And they called it a mini computer. The term microcomputer hadn't been coined yet. And I looked at the kit, it wasn't really a kit. It was a series of boards you could buy and then find parts and things like that. And in as much as I went to a lot of ham fests, I found that I could get a lot of those parts. I could get a lot of wire wrap sockets, wire wrap tools, things like that. And Intel had a student special at that time. It was the 8008 microprocessor and a couple of support chips which were needed, along with a ton of documentation for $58. a decent amount of money for a student, but I had saved some up. So I got that. And from that, I started building my first computer, 256 bytes of memory. It ran at a clock speed less than 500 kilohertz. It had toggle switches and red LEDs, the only color that was really available at the time. And that was it. The embarrassing question was, when you showed it off to friends, hey, great, what can you do with it? And what I finally figured out the answer was learn. And that's what I did. I learned about digital electronics. I learned about microprocessors. This then, I had started a part-time job with Radio Shack, the mall store, and the TRS-80 comes out. And I was one of the few people in the company and in the region that knew anything about computers. Moreover, I knew how to sell computers. So I was doing pretty good, along with the stereo stuff and, all the other stuff that we sold with computers. And I got into programming and had actually started up a small software business for niche interests, dentists, insurance agents, where they had to renew policies within a certain time with things. But while the insurance companies wanted them to reevaluate the policies because of losses, especially auto, they were not computerized to the point where they could provide that information, but they were somehow holding the agents responsible for it. So I started to turn a nice coin doing that. The Radio Shack thing is what got me into New Jersey then with a computer center.
So was the TRS-80 your first, did that become your first computer?
That would be the first assembled computer that I had. I had a couple of single board computer kits. There was a Motorola 6800 based Educator 2, and that was a limited kind of thing. But again, different processor set, you're learning different things and you could expand it.
The TRS-80, I think, was that a CP/M operating system?
It eventually had a flavor of CP/M. The issue with that was that most CP/M systems, first of all, were 8-inch floppies. The TRS-80 used 5 1/4. And while CP/M resided in the lowest realms of memory, starting at address 0, Radio Shack had put ROM in there, the basic 1 and basic 2 ROMs. So CP/M had to be, repurposed somewhat so that it started higher with things. But yes, a version of CP/M was available. By the time that the floppy drives came out, there was this operating system at the company released called TRS-DOS or TRIS-DOS. And by certain nature, it was somewhat CP/M-ish. Command line interpreter, many of the same features, things like that with it. But initially, it was cassette tape, AFSK type format for things. And there were a variety of those that were available. I did have a system that used 8-inch floppies. I had the 5 1/4. I've gone through all sorts of realms. The first computer I ever laid hands on was a Honeywell 200, large system, took up a room, 4 9-track tape drives, printer you didn't want to run with the cover open because of the noise, and actual core memory, a whole 24K of core memory. I had an excellent computer science teacher in high school and learned Fortran. But more importantly, I learned the structure of a computer language, the ways in which you talk to a computer. And having learned that was knowledge that was portable to any other language that I've learned. It was invaluable the way that, and I'll give a shout out, Bill Freeze. At one time, he was a ham. I think he let his license lapse many years ago, but brilliant guy, a much better teacher than we ever deserved to have.
I don't recognize the name.
Yeah, Freas, last name.
He was someone local to you, or was he an industry pioneer?
No, he was somewhat local to me. He was a junior systems analyst, if I remember this correctly, for Bell, and had a very promising career. But his father had become ill, and he had a farm. And Bill came back to help run the farm. He had a teaching degree, actually in several areas: computer science, mathematics, chemistry, and I'm leaving something else out. And he came back and he started teaching computer science and chemistry in our district.
As I remember now, this whole evolution of computers and stuff, was surprisingly Radio Shack was like way out ahead of probably everybody else for bringing computers to the people, right? I think even before the TRS-80, the TRS-80, they had, I remember being with a friend of mine at the time in San Diego and seeing one of the very first Radio Shack computers that used cassette tape for loading its programs and writing data on it.
Right. This was a very common format at the time. We had gone initially from teletypes with paper tape. The folks that could afford it would buy an ASR 33 or 35, which was an ASCII machine, and you could save and load programs on 8-bit paper tape. Those who were hams and liked playing with software and were students and didn't have a lot of money, I went to a ham fest in our area, picked up a couple of the Baudot or Murray 5-level teletypes for $15. And I wrote software that converted Baudot into ASCII and back again. And for the characters that weren't available, like a greater than symbol, I borrowed from my Fortran 4 days, and greater than was .gt in Fortran. So I did that in BASIC with this extra front end that I had written, and I could load 5-level tape and it would convert it into an ASCII format for me. It wasn't real efficient. It was slow, but it was cheap. And it was a lot less than $840 plus shipping, which is what an ASR 33 was going for at that time.
Was the computer industry, or at least this was the beginning of your career? Did you spend your entire career then in the computer business?
No. I had worked for a company that took me in and out of Bell Labs, again, being in New Jersey, and Murray Hill, Freehold, various facilities. And I was fortunate enough to actually get to meet Dennis Ritchie and Brian Kernighan at Bell Labs, spend a few minutes with them, learned a lot in a fairly short period of time. Those were the guys, of course, that created the Unix operating system, the C language, and the whole philosophy behind that. But anyway, going back to the company had been doing well, and then all of a sudden, you could feel that it wasn't doing well. And one day, my office saw out into the lobby area, 2 of the 3 partners got into a knockdown, drag-out fight. The state police were called to break it up, mostly because the receptionist was the wife of a trooper, and she just decided to call her husband about it. It went on from there. I called one of my clients, which was a partner in the second largest accounting firm in the state, regional accounting firm in the state. And we had some, light conversations over lunch or drinks or whatever about me working there. And I said, I think now is the time that you want to hire me. And so I went to work for an accounting firm as the manager of what was then called EDP, Electronic Data Processing, which we would now call IT, and helped create software that we sold to other accounting firms and that for practice management, tax planning, different things like that. And it was an industry that really hadn't been tapped yet. So we were fortunate enough to start that up and work those kinds of things. To, I think, my credit, nobody ever asked me if I was a CPA. In fact, nobody ever asked me if I was an accountant. I just projected enough confidence and chutzpah that everybody accepted me as such.
Where was amateur radio in all of this during this period of time? Were you an active ham while you were pursuing these other things in the computer?
I was as much as I could be. I had by that time a TS-520, the first commercial radio that I got. In fact, the original one that I had, I ended up selling, and then I regretted that, and I bought another one. And so I had that and was in an apartment, and if you pulled one of the tubes out and limited yourself to CW and kind of dialed it down, you could get away with a coaxial dipole laying around the apartment perimeter as an indoor antenna, and still work some decent stations that way. That was my ham radio stuff, plus an ICOM WA3UVV22S, which was their first synthesized 2-meter radio programmed via 1N914 diodes that went on a board. And then there were little mods you could make, and you could actually get it to cover the whole, then 146 to 148 band where the FM repeaters were. Later, that would expand to 145. But it was a great little radio, had an excellent receiver for its time.
Yeah, it was a clever transceiver.
Yeah. So a lot of my local amateur radio activity was in the car as I was driving to and from work or going around different trips or, whatever. But my HF stuff was pretty much there. There were some times, though, that I did take that 520 and put it in the car because it did run off at 12 volts, a lot of current. 6146s pulled 2.2 amps each just for the filaments. So, think about that in terms of modern solid state gear now. And it was bulky, but it worked and it was great. And I had a ham stick with a Hustler trunk mount that I had on there. And that worked, kind of nicely from that.
Yeah, I've got a Kenwood TS520 sitting on the operating position here as well that I've had probably for, 45 years or so. Before we kind of wrap up the computer business, let's talk a little bit about, you mentioned on your QRZ page that you were building a retro DEC PDP-8 and PDP-11 kits. Can we talk a little bit about those?
Sure. My interest in PDP-11s came about as I was writing software, and I wanted to do some additional things. Or Heath Kit, but the Heath Company made a deal at the same time, I think this was 77, 78, with, as they brought the H8 out, which was 8080 based. They also had made a deal with Digital Equipment Corporation for a version of the LSI 11 CPU, which was a small 1103, the base PDP-11. And from some contacts that I had at the Pittsburgh Area Computer Club, so I belonged to a couple of computer clubs at the time, I was able to get some additional DEC hardware, and I picked up an H11 and started to, and the nice thing about the H11 from Heathkit was that this came with a lot of free software, whereas if I had bought that directly from Digital, it did not. So this would have been a lot of additional money just for the languages and things like that. So a nice bargain that Heath had at the time. And that's what got me into the PDP-11 world. Later on, I got approached by somebody that had a PDP-8, which they were using for some control purposes. And they had heard that I knew something about computers and wanted to know if I knew anything about this. And I said, well, I know some things about it. What do you want to do? And they wanted to change a few things around. And so I very quickly learned the 8's instruction set, which was brilliantly minimal. And for anybody, and there are emulators that you can do. You can get FPGA, field programmable grid array, single board computers now, and code those to emulate a PDP-8. But it is a great way to learn how a computer thinks and what goes on and what you need for a minimal set of opcodes and things like that. To me, it's almost something that should be mandatory for somebody wanting to go into computer science, that they learn this architecture. But that's how I got involved in that. There was a ham, and I did successfully reprogram PDP-8, learn more about it. Fast forward many years, there was a gentleman out in California, and I can't think of the name of his company now, but he created some kits around the RCA 1802 microprocessor, but also the PDP-8, which both Intersil and Harris came out with microprocessors that emulated a PDP-8. They were 12-bit microprocessors. First, it was the 6100 and then the 6120. And you can get the 6120 still and build up things around that. And he built a couple of, well, the SBC 6120R for reduced component set is a large board. It's out of production now with toggle switches and LEDs, and you can have a rotary control to check the registers and things like that, and run Focal and Deck Basic and other software for the PDP-8. The only downside of that kit was the lowest baud rate you could do is 300. So if you had some old paper tape stuff and a teletype that ran at 110 baud, you couldn't use that. You were going to have to make up a paper tape reader again, which is not a big deal to do.
Right, but would anybody do that? I mean, when I saw this and I was preparing for the episode, I found actually on Tindy.com like a PDP-8 replica kit. So it has the, the front panel with all the lights and the toggle switches. And I guess the question is this the kind of thing that you're building? Something that's like a replica of a PDP-8 but may have a Arduino or something like that running underneath it? Or...
Well, something like that with the Harris 6120 chip.
Right, okay.
Trying to get a PDP-8, either the original or an E or whatever variant, very, very difficult. And either it's in horrendous shape or somebody wants the price of a house for it.
Right. If you've got one of these retro kits, could you get close enough, to the user experience, without having, the PDP-8, as I recall, or the PDP-11, these were minis, right? So they were actually quite large cabinets, big power supplies. You'd need a moving van, to move it into your office. So
it's certainly a two-man lift,
right?
The original, and with the original that had core memory, the memory stack, which sits on top of the 8, is actually larger than the process, the machine itself. Yeah, those straight 8s, the originals, they are very, very difficult to find. There are museums. The Info Age Museum in Wall Township, New Jersey, has at least one that's functional. And there's some 11s there. They have a great computer museum. They have an Apollo guidance computer there. This is a Marconi hotel and station. They have a dish, which was used with Project Diana, both moon bounce and some early weather stuff. And it's been restored. It's steerable and a lot of EME or moon bounce stuff from time to time goes on there. Plus, there's an antique amateur radio club that supports the Museum of Radio and Television that's there. If you're ever in the area, it's a great place for anyone to go to.
And now this mid-show break. The QSO Today project now has over 500 podcast episodes and hundreds of hours of virtual ham radio expo presentations, all freely available and fully supported by you, the listener. This short message and the later mention of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast are the only breaks in the program. QSO Today has no commercial sponsors, so no one influences the content or direction. This project exists solely to promote amateur radio and the people who make it thrive. Producing QSO Today is like a half-time job. Your support at any level covers the tools, hosting, and production costs that keep it going. And while it is a labor of love, it isn't free. Only about 6% of listeners contribute. Please consider making a donation. Use the slider on our donations page to set up the amount that reflects the value that you get from each episode or from our library of educational videos. Make it monthly to help secure the next 500 episodes. You can also become a listener sponsor, shop on Amazon using our referral link, share QSO Today with friends, subscribe to our mailing list and YouTube channel, and help spread the word. Every action is value for value. Keep QSO Today alive by taking action now. We return to our QSO. Before we started, I actually had mentioned to you that the reason that I sent you the invitation was I had been reading your column, your monthly column in Spectrum Monitor magazine, where you write a monthly column called Digitally Speaking, focused on digital radio technologies, both commercial and amateur radio. Anybody that reads Spectrum Monitor knows that it's not just an amateur radio magazine, but that it really covers the full spectrum of communications, radio operations, both broadcast, commercial, and amateur radio. How did you get started writing this column, and specifically why this area of interest? Was this an area of interest that you had and you decided to bring it, or was it an area of interest that you decided to write about and then kind of learn about it, as you went along?
Both in that, and I have to go back to CQ magazine, which I also have written for every one of their publications that was active at that time. Of course, the magazine and the company is no more. But I got started. I sent an article to. I have to go back even a little bit further. I was inspired by some of the other authors in amateur radio magazines, and I had always toyed with the idea of writing, but I never actually did something about it. There's an old philosophical thing that there are 4 frogs on a log. One decides to jump off. How many frogs are on the log? Well, it's still 4 because deciding to do something isn't the same as actually doing it. So I finally decided to do something. I sent in this article with some pictures to Rich Moseson at CQ, and he didn't quite think it was for CQ, but they had World Radio online as one of their publications, and he thought it'd be great for that. So from that, I met an excellent editor by the name of Richard Fisher, who lives out in California, and I think somewhere in Orange County. And he liked my stuff, and I wrote another article. He liked that, and he said, have you ever thought about writing a column? And I said, well, sure, why not? And that got started there. When World Radio folded, then I started writing for CQ and also Popular Communications. And I had something in CQ VHF as well. I had the idea, I could see where digital radio was going, and I had the idea of writing a column on that, but CQ already had somebody that was writing on those topics from time to time. So they weren't really interested in, that topic, but go ahead and continue what you're writing, already. So I approached Ken Reitz at the Spectrum Monitor, and he gave it a shot. I had said something about a column, and he said, well, let's do a few articles and see, maybe, and then it got to an every other month. And then it was, he was getting good feedback on it, like what I was turning out, and it became a monthly column. And I think my first interest with digital voice radio was D-Star. That was the first, for hams by hams format. I picked up P25, which is used by municipalities predominantly, but there was a P25 supporting repeater nearby where I lived. And I had a friend who was a Motorola, I'll just say enthusiast. Obsession might be as too strong of a word, and maybe not, but he has the software for everything. And I said, if I got a hold of this portable, the Sabre, would you set it up for me? He said, yeah. And a handful of us would talk on that. D-Star came up. And then Yaesu came out with this C4FM, which basically is a 4-carrier FM signal. If you think of radio teletype having mark and space, that could be considered a C2 FM. This is just a little more complex. It's a die-bit protocol, which goes back to the concept, back to the Bell 212 modem. And for the non-technical, it's kind of like, instead of just ones and zeros, you have pairs of ones and zeros. So think of 2 little boats out in the ocean. They can both be up at the peak of the wave, a 1-1. They can be both down at the bottom, as well as 0-0, or you can have 1-0 or 0-1, and one's higher than the other. And that's how a die-bit protocol works. Yaesu did a very good job in producing a product. They did not do a very good job in explaining the product. So they brought out the FT1 portable and had it under a lucite dome at, I think it was Hamvention 2013, but not much that explained what it was about. And of course, there's no mobile radio, there's no repeater, there's no published concept. People were wondering more and more, what's this about? Time goes by, and I remained curious about it. But of course, as we learned as kids with walkie-talkies, you got to have 2, and they've got to be on the same channel. In this case, the same DV methodology. And I talked a friend of mine into buying one, so I bought one. We were used to D-Star, and when we first tried it digitally, our mutual response was wow, because the audio quality was so good with this thing.
Better than D-Star?
Better than D-Star, better than P25. And sure, we were on our way to a ham club meeting, and the Gloucester County Amateur Radio Club in southern New Jersey, and showed it off after the meeting to a couple of other D-Star enthusiasts. Almost to a person, everybody went, wow. And so we quickly had built up a group that we could at least talk to each other on simplex with. And shortly thereafter, Yaesu announced a mobile, they announced a repeater, and they announced this concept called system fusion. And they better explained what was going on with things. And this started quite the revolution. And at that time, I thought, boy, this is going to take off not only with fusion, but you're going to see more and more in the way of digital radio and formats and things like that. And this was about the time that I approached CQ and then ended up in the Spectrum monitor over that. And it's just grown and grown and grown from there.
Well, I think I remember at the time that D-Star came out, there was a concern in the amateur community that D-Star was a format that was specific to ICOM, that C4M would be specific to Yaesu. And so all of a sudden now you have the amateur radio manufacturers coming to their own format. So in order for you to, justify putting up a D-Star repeater for your community or a system fusion system for your community, you'd have to go, to one vendor rather than, all the vendors sharing. It's like, well, it was one thing with FM or single sideband or any of the amateur radio transceivers. They all will all talk to each other. All of a sudden, we now had these silos by manufacturers. Did you treat that as a subject in your column as well, in terms of what that would mean in terms of communicating in amateur radio and acceptance by the amateur community of these formats?
I did, probably in a different way. When D-Star was released, the deal with JARL, Japan's version of our ARRL, but a little different. In order for ICOM to move forward with D-Star, there needed to be a second vendor. So kind of with a wink and a nod, they enlisted the folks at Kenwood to say, oh, we'll produce D-Star equipment too. They did not until this century, where that started. And actually I would say the upcoming Kenwood tri-band D-Star APRS, leaving something out mobile, the TM D750A is probably the best D-Star radio. Now, I haven't actually held one yet, but probably the best D-Star radio on the market when it gets to the market. But let's go back to this other stuff. When ICOM released D-Star, they really, really, really wanted to promote that digital aspect of it. So the repeaters were digital only. Even though the radios could be analog FM and D-Star, the repeaters supported digital only. This meant that clubs did not want to give up their 2-meter repeater allocation to digital. And there's not a lot of room in most areas for an extra repeater on 2 meters. So UHF became the band of choice for D-Star, typically 70 centimeters, although they have some equipment that supported 23 centimeters. When Yaesu came out some years later with System Fusion, they learned many lessons from what had come before and incorporated that into the design. The repeaters would support analog or digital, and they had the intelligence to determine what that inbound signal was and switch the output to match. So you could have analog in, analog out, digital in, digital out, or this mixed mode of analog or digital in with analog out, tending to, with the hopes of introducing people to that. This was what hams really wanted to see, something where we gain this new digital format, but we don't lose our ties to what we're comfortable with in the way of analog FM. So marketing-wise was kind of brilliant. The other thing they did was they gave away repeaters to clubs, part of a beta testing session period that went on for a while. You would get a repeater, a mobile, and a portable. As part of this package, you had to send back reports periodically as to how many users, how, when it was adopted, what the growth is like, any issues you might have had with the repeater, this kind of thing, as they worked out what features were wanted and if there were any issues with that. And I'm not sure if anybody at Yaesu had paid attention to how RCA introduced color television to America, but folks had black and white TV, and there was resistance to color because it was more expensive. But there was a restaurant that we used to go to on the weekends, and they had a TV that you could see on the bar end of things, the lounge, a nicer word. And my mother, who had resisted any conversation about color TV, happened to glance over and see the Jackie Gleason show was on and the June Taylor dancers, and it was all in color. Because what RCA had done was they had gone into these places where a lot of people gathered, and they said, we'll replace your black and white TV with a color TV for nothing or for a very minimal cost. And of course, as a bar owner, you're going to say, hey, if people are going to sit around and watch TV and drink more and eat more, yeah, I'm going to do that. It doesn't going to cost me anything or not very much. And when she saw the Jackie Gleason show in color, she leans over and asked my grandfather, how much are those TVs again? So Yaesu kind of did that by, hitting the market. Within months, they had the population of repeaters that it took ICOM 5 years to get to. And within a year, 18 months, there were more System Fusion repeaters in place than there were D-Star. So, accelerated growth, and people were very, very enthused about it. The mobile had a color touch screen. That's ham sexy. I met one person at then my local ham radio outlet, and he was from Reading, PA, and said, do they have a repeater going up in Reading? He said, I have no idea. I don't really care about digital voice, but look at this radio. I got to have one of these.
Oh, interesting. So multi-mode Yaesu radio.
Right, with a full APRS feature set, dual VFOs, so you can go around and have all the APRS stuff going on, and you have, your digital modes or digital mode.
What does the proliferation of Yaesu C4M repeaters look like now? I mean, are there lots and lots of them across the United States?
There are. It is the predominant active DV methodology, second by DMR.
Really? Second? DMR is second?
Yes. And that was driven by two things. Very inexpensive radios that came out of China, and a networking breakaway from the C bridge, which Motorola used in promoting Moto Turbo. And we'll get to these different codecs. Remind me to loop back to that in a sec. The issue with C bridge is that it could only support 16 different repeaters or nodes at a time. Great if you're a municipality, not so great for ham radio. We want to put dozens, hundreds, whatever, internet connect, whatever we want to. We're the folks that take a technology and, take it into a back alley, beat it up, and take whatever we want out of it. So that's what was happening then with DMR. The low-cost radios kind of drove that. And then you had radios that had features in them that were driven toward how a ham would use DMR beyond what, a government or commercial agency would use DMR for. So it fell into number 2. And then D-Star's 3. I want to say that P25 comes next, the next gen world, which Kenwood and ICOM did join hands in. ICOM markets it under the IDAS product, Kenwood NextEdge. And then we have, who am I leaving out? M17, which we'll talk about M17 in a minute too, because their initiatives were really what you brought up, a concern about manufacturer-specific things.
Right.
But the manufacturer-specific things are not as much of a concern as many people believe. Everybody that has a DV methodology, whatever it is, publishes something called a common air interface document. And from that, if you have the wherewithal to do it, you can create devices that support that particular methodology. This brings us to all the hotspots that are on the market. And in fact, I just finished and sent in an article to TSM, which will be in the January issue. I have a couple pictures I have to correct. So as long as I do that in time with Ken, he'll have it in the January issue. And it talks specifically about hotspots. And this was a subject I talked about a while ago, but a reader suggested that I revisit it. So I decided, you know what? Great idea. A company called Shark RF markets a product line called OpenSpot. And they're up to the 4. I have a 3. And the 3 functions as, borrowing from Star Trek canon, a universal translator. I can use my system fusion radio and communicate with the P25 reflectors. I can connect to D-Star.
In other words, your hotspot is transcoding from C4M to, as long as it's a digital mode, right?
Exactly.
From one to the other, from C4M to P25.
Right. I can use one of those little low-power DMR UHF handhelds and, talk to System Fusion folks or DMR folks or whatever. It's all back and forth like that. It's a fantastic little product. Zoom Radio is another company that makes something like that, and they support M17. And M17 is the nascent DV methodology driven by those who wanted something that was manufacturer agnostic, that, created by hams, for hams, could be manipulated by hams. There's a board called a Module 17 that you can attach to any FM transceiver that has a high-speed, like a packet port, the 9600 baud port on it. And that will give you digital capabilities with M17. Connect Systems makes an M17 portable.
Didn't the M17 project, did it capsize, or maybe the...
Oh, no, quite the opposite. In fact, and I'm forgetting their names too. This is old age, or I just have too much to remember anymore. But they received a very noticeable grant from, not the ARRL.
No, the...
Bill Karn,
right,
from Bell Lab and
right.
Bellcore was a leader in this. Basically, they sold off a lot of their IP addresses that they weren't going to use in the 44 domain, and got a lot of money, and they decided to make the money available as grants. And they gave the M17 project a hefty sum with that. And they are using it well to develop more and more things within this methodology. So you're starting to see repeaters come up. Again, this is a very homebrew kind of thing.
Open source.
Yeah, open source. There are boards like the DVM, and different variants from that. If you go to Repeater Builder, and there's a hyphen in there, .com, you'll find some digital repeater controllers made by somebody actually local to my area here in Somerset County. And these can take an old analog repeater and turn it digital for a minimal amount of money. I've actually seen somebody do it with a tube-based repeater. They had to add some circuitry so that the, several hundred volts didn't connect with this poor little board. It wanted to see 12 and 5, but it can be done. And, if you're willing to experiment and, ask some questions, and you go to your club and you tap into those folks that have some of that technical knowledge, you can do some wondrous things these days.
What's your favorite operating mode? I mean, I see that you're kind of all over the place. You're a renaissance man when it comes to ham radios, so that you're doing all kinds of things. What's your favorite operating mode when you decide you just want to, sit with amateur radio and not read or write about it?
Like so many things, it depends on my mood. I do enjoy voice conversations like this. There's, not only the speech, but the music that goes along with that, the pace of it, that kind of thing. I enjoy the fact of making new friends and learning new things and learning about people and places and stuff like that. But I also still like CW. I mean, at first it was one of those things, well, you must learn this, kind of like, you must eat your green beans or your asparagus or spinach, but you get to a point where you like it. And I enjoy CW. There's a very tactile, simplistic thing about, being able to touch that key and send a simple digital signal out that somebody head interprets. Hopefully they're not using a decoder, and comes back to you again. This was one of the earliest uses for CW, or CW decoders and keyboards and things like that for home computers, for the hobbyist computers. That and RTTY, first two digital modes that got computerized. But I like, staying away from all that. And, other than an electronic keyer, I still have a collection I still have my novice straight key. And I like to get that off the shelf once in a while, plug it in. And, those memories of youth, flat stomach, no aches and pains.
Yeah.
I think it takes me back in time a little bit. I have a Heathkit AT1 transmitter, which was their first amateur transmitter. It does not have a 15-meter band position on the switch because we didn't have 15 meters at the time of its manufacture. It's that old. And I enjoy getting on that. But at the same time, I like RTTY. I'll fiddle around with, FT8. FT8 doesn't excite me that much. It's more my computer talking to your computer. It's kind of drive-by contacts. And I prefer the human interaction more with things. But I like satellite stuff. I'm building up some stuff for Moonbounce right now because my wife, who's also a ham, is very interested in hearing her call sign or seeing her call sign come back from bouncing off the moon, seconds later, that sort of thing.
And now this mid-show break. Every 2 weeks I listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George, KJ6VU, Vince, VE6LK, Mark, N6MTS, Thomas, K4SWL, Michael, VA3MW, and Rod, VA3ON, and their guest on often topical and important projects in amateur radio. This discussion amongst the regulars and their guests remind me of the conversations that I used to listen to on 146.94 and 146.46 megahertz in Orange County, California, while working on my own workbench almost 50 years ago. It is amazing how much practical ham radio knowledge that we can absorb by listening to the Workbench podcast that starts to make sense when we start our own deep dive into our own projects. So join me by listening to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast now and as George and crew push beyond 200 episodes. You can get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast by clicking on the banner in this week's show notes page. And now, back to our QSO. What rig are you operating for these various operating modes?
There's an FT991A. That's going to have an amplifier attached to it when we do EME. And really, I'm just going to do a pair of antennas, which was suggested to me instead of cross-polarized Yagis, just use two different antennas and, preamps and mix them. From an HF standpoint,
right?
I have a TS520 still, a 520S. I have an 830 that I spend a lot of time on. I have a FTDX10. I have an ICOM 718 that I go back to every once in a while. Also liking QRP, I have an IC 705 and an FT818, and I'm saving up for an FTX1 just because. But I also have a lot of stuff that I've built over time. I have some old MFJ 9200s and just some homebrew stuff. In fact, I just sent away to the 4 states QRP club to get a Cricket 20 to join some of the CW fun on 14060. They have little sprints if you're in the 1 watt or less class. And I will say with QRP at one time, I thought that was the most ridiculous idea. My DX20, I wasn't sure that just 20 watts was going to cut it. And one day I had a conversation with a ham at the other electronics store in town, State Electronics, and he was talking about low power stuff. And I said, I don't understand how that even works. And he said, you know what? if you will buy these things today, which I had enough money, it was like $10 or so in parts, and build this transmitter, I'll bet that you will work stations and have fun on the air. And the tube was a 117 N7 GT, which is something that can produce about 3 watts. It has a 117 volt filament, so you don't need a transformer for the filaments. And if you're a daredevil like me, you don't need a transformer for the tube. You just have to be very, very careful about what you touch and how you wire that key when you put it on the air. And I did, in fact, work a number of stations after I had whacked that together. And I went back and I said, Delbert, you were absolutely correct. You were right. I'm having fun with this. And from that, I built up a whole bunch of QRP stuff, both tube and solid state over the years. That's a great area for experimentation because simple receivers, simple transmitters, you don't have to do it from scratch. You can do it for little kits that are still available. No, it's not Heathkit, but that's okay. It is what it is. Just embrace what you have available. Light a candle instead of cursing the darkness kind of thing. And you can have a lot of fun with this. One of the newest members coming into my amateur radio club, the Uniontown Amateur Radio Club, is someone who is building his first HF transceiver. He just tested over the weekend of the 7th, passed his tech, passed his general, just got his call sign, and he's building a QMX transceiver kit. And he has a heavy interest in CW, so I'm not sure which mode he's going to go on the air first. With that, this is the direction that he wants to go through it. And, again, the Greek chorus of Elmer's, which now I get to be part of, is supporting him and trying to help him and give him advice on different things.
Well, it sounds to me like your club actually knows how to handle new members. Do I have that right?
You do, and that brings me to a wonderful aspect of things. It does require structure and some purposefulness, but like any other habit, once you've done it for a while, you don't realize you're doing it. You're just doing it. We have a club of now over 100 members, I think 115, and we have 3 in the pipeline for January. We picked up, I believe, 15 last year. We lost a couple as silent keys, which every club is going to do. We have been growing at a very steady pace. It started probably about 10 years ago as a concerted effort to get more members, to get higher visibility for the club, and to better answer questions that existing members and folks that wanted to come in as new hams had to address. We are very friendly. We introduce new visitors. We don't just expect them to walk around. I liken it to going to a party. You go to a party and you have to introduce yourself to everybody. Nobody takes you around. It's not as enjoyable as experience if the host takes you around and says, hi, this is John, Bob, Mark, Donna, Mary, that sort of thing. And we're one of 4 clubs in the Western Pennsylvania section that has their own property. So that's an advantage as well. We do have some higher bills to pay, but we have, something very, very nice. And we have a lot of state-of-the-art gear. We have some older gear. We have a vintage radio museum in a separate building that goes back to the 1930s in some things, 40s, 50s. We have almost everything that the Heath Company ever made. We're still searching for a few things. We get a lot of donations, or we find some things at different auctions that, we have a budget separate from the club budget for that. But as far as membership and this sort of thing, we do that. We do something called Fourth Wednesday. Fourth Wednesday is a continuing ed kind of thing. And we have covered stuff from antenna design to the care and maintenance of a 2-cycle engine, generator repair, just, all sorts of different things, radio teletype, FT8, just the whole cornucopia of amateur radio with that. And we ask members, what is it that you would like to learn more about? At our Christmas party just the other day, I was approached by somebody, and they would like to talk about wire antennas. So that's what we're going to do when we resume. We don't do it in January and February because in January, chances are we're not going to get up the driveway to the club because of the snow. And we've had the same issue in February of last year. So I may not have a fourth Friday then, but we also have meeting programs. We had one of our members, Rick Tressler, talk about the rebuild and redesign that he did of a Viking transmitter that he bought solely for the case for another one that he had. But as it sat there and looked so sad in the corner, he decided to do something with it. And he's a big AM guy and encourages other people to have fun with AM as well. We've, done some stuff with Night Kit T60s. You wouldn't believe the audio quality coming out of that T60. And these are mods that Rick knows how to do. Vikings, we have a couple of Collins A-line kilowatt stations, the Gold Dust Twins. We have Heathkit DX100s. We just picked up Mohawk Chippewa amplifier. We're looking for a power supply for the Chippewa. That's going to be fun to find. But I'm trying to think of Cheyenne. All sorts of, different things that we have. And I'm proud to say, and it's not my efforts, it's, I help, but really George Siner, who has been the club's caretaker for many, many years. George is a genius when it comes to vintage radios and has a strong interest in this, and he's really been the driving force of the museum.
Mm-hmm. What's his call sign?
His call sign is WA3UVV.
George Siner.
Yeah.
Okay.
And he has 95% of what we have in the museum in workable condition. So if you wanted to, you could take down, a Trio Kenwood or something that Allied Radio produced or a Night Kit or one of the Heath kits and go over to one of the operating positions and put it on the air. We can easily have 5 different stations running simultaneously if we wanted, which would be nice for field day, winter field day, other contests. That's one of the things I'm hoping to encourage more in 26 is more and more people getting interested in contesting. We have all the gear. We have a fantastic antenna farm. We just need operators.
How does your ham club reach out to non-hams in the community? If you're going to do these Wednesday evening lectures, for example, on 2-cycle motor repair, would you advertise that to the general community just as a way to attract people in, even on that subject?
There are meeting notices that you can put in the newspaper in any community. Whether you think the newspaper is effective or not, it's there. We have a nice little AM station that I intend to do more with in the coming year. Their bulletin board notices. We have a Thursday night net, which is analog FM and also incorporates Echo Link now. And we found that many people listen into it on their scanners. And we've gotten some members that way. We held an open house the same way that I got interested or found out about the club. I was interested. I was just frustrated in not knowing where to go. And we got good play out of that open house last April. And we're going to do that again this year. We just had advertised, and again, through Facebook, social media, and not just the amateur radio stuff, but, things that are happening in your area types of pages that way. A lot of people are not going to be interested in it. Ham radio is not a hobby for everyone, but for those who are, it's a way of reaching out with things. We were very fortunate as a result of inviting one of our elected officials to field day 2 years ago, State Representative Charity Grimm Krupa. She was, very enlightened about amateur radio. We encouraged her to come to other meetings and some of our social functions that we have. We do a midsummer barbecue. That's sort of our cookout if you're a barbecue purist. And she has access to a video crew out of the state capitol and wanted to do a series in the county of, interesting things you didn't know that were there. And we were the first production that she had done. She said she's extremely happy with it. It's on her website, her Facebook page. Also, our club website, W3PIE.org, links to that. And it's a high-quality production, interviews two of our club members. One is a high-speed CW enthusiast. He's one of those guys that could have a conversation with you at the same time that he's talking to somebody else with a bug on the air. And the other member is the technical director of our county emergency management agency. And he'll blush when I say one of the architects of an inter-county trunk system called I-Cores, which links several counties in western Pennsylvania together. You can go to the other far end of the state with a handheld radio and communicate back to your own 911 center with that. And the nice thing about that is, let's say something happens to your 911 center. Within a period of minutes, all of that traffic can get handed off to an adjacent or non-adjacent I-Cores member 911 center, and they can handle all your dispatching needs until you can get your problem rectified.
Amazing. Well, it sounds to me like you've got a lot of great stuff happening in western Pennsylvania. And what excites you that now the most in amateur radio? I mean, it seems to me that you've got a very broad brush, so it might be hard to choose one, but what is exciting you the most right now about what's happening in ham radio?
I would say that overall, there is a positive upswing in things going on. The trick in getting new hams is not how many new licenses there are. You can, there are these ham in a day classes, which I don't really like. Yes, they get people licensed, but they're like the CPA boards, or if you're trying to pass the bar, you can take a class or a series of classes, and right out of the gate from that, go take the exam and you'll pass. It doesn't mean that a week or 2 weeks from now, you're going to retain very much of what it was that you learned if you really don't have that information. So great, you've got new members, you've got new hams, but stay with them. You don't necessarily have to assign a member to them, but keep somebody in touch with them so that the fire that's there keeps going. There are a lot of clubs doing that. We need more clubs to do that. There are clubs that are dying a slow death, and there are those, like mine, that are thriving well, but you must put effort into it. Bad behavior ignored becomes worse. Positive behavior ignored becomes bad behavior. So, for the clubs that are doing that, I'm very excited about that. There's another new magazine that came out a few months ago called SWR Magazine.
I just heard about that this week, yeah.
Yeah, go and find it. Go back to the original issues. I think they're up to 5 or 6 now. Short, informative, not too deeply technical, but enough to interest the reader and to entice the reader in exploring something if they have some interest in that. Very nice publication. And they produce a magazine in English and a magazine in Spanish. So that's kind of that's a good indicator to me that there is growth and that.
Well, that covers most of the Western Hemisphere. So Right. The diversity of hams that we're seeing more and more women enter this, as we are seeing more and more women encouraged in mathematics, high-level mathematics, not just, business math, accounting, things like that. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but, the sciences, which going back many decades, they were encouraged with. The first computer programmers were women. But at some point, the guy said, oh, you know what? Why don't you go handle the tape library and type up my report? I'm going to go do the programming now and the hardware design and stuff. We need to bring women back into that. And in many areas we are. And we're seeing that in amateur radio. We have one of our club officers is a woman. One of the new licensees from this last testing session is a woman. And
those sorts of things. But reach out and people that are doing that. It is what you make of it. We have many technologies improving around us. Some of those we follow, some of those we drive, and, we're in between, or we, again, manipulate. We take something and say, hey, I want to do this. Here's this Android phone that's a burner phone that I got at the drugstore for $20. And without doing anything to activate it on the cellular network, it's still going to tell me where I am. I can put an APRS app on it and use that. I can download through Wi-Fi, something for SSTV, and use this as a SSTV handheld appliance with a cable for my radio, VHF or HF. There's all sorts of things if you think a little out of the box.
I certainly think that the history of computing owes its technical advancements to the ham radio operators that were, very early in, as you were. Right.
If you invite a reporter out to do a story on your club or amateur radio, don't just tell them about it. Sit them down and let them get on the radio. The excitement you're going to see in their face is what many of us had when we first sat down and communicated. They will not make that, but my cell phone's a radio and I can call somebody in London, And of course, the smart-eye question is, do you know anybody in London? This sort of thing. But you let somebody sit down with either a digital, voice radio, a portable that's linked into something, and they're talking to somebody in Austria or New Zealand or England or Canada or just, a couple of states away. There is that magic of radio that comes through, and they will write a better article about it. And the photographer, if it's a separate person, will get that shot of them. And that drives it. And you build up a relationship so that you can get that reporter to come back, especially if they're a freelance reporter, because it's in their best interest to do another article on you that they get paid for. That's one way of spreading the excitement. Letting people go beyond the technology, that this is a great way to make friends around the world. If you're trying to invite kids and you have to talk to their parents, what does ham radio expose you to? Geography. Where's that country that I just talked to? History. What's their form of government and how long have they been around and these sorts of things. Foreign language practice. It's nice to talk to a native speaker in Paris, not just your teacher and other students as you're, learning French. Science, math, that's all there. It really incorporates that, but we do have to do that. Libraries is another way to reach out and get to people. The ARRL has a nice book deal. It's somewhere between $200 to $300, and it has the license guides, which you want to refresh every several years, handbook, introductions, things like that anybody, any student in school can access and do a PR piece with the newspaper that you made this donation. In conjunction with all the other things I do, I'm also the public information coordinator for the section and the affiliated club coordinator. They kind of go hand in hand because they're both stimulating clubs and they're both outreach positions as well.
How about that?
Those are the kinds of things you need to do, but it's not hard to do. It's not that you're going to have to give up your 9-to-5 job to do this stuff. You just find a little time here and there, and you build it up. You look for different aspects of things. One thing I want to do this year, and I'm designing the card right now, we're going to hand out to members in the club that want them, take a handful of business cards. And the business cards simply, if you're talking to somebody about amateur radio, here's a takeaway piece that has the club contact information, something of what amateur radio or the club is about or what we're doing, this sort of thing, that somebody can have as a tangible thing, with that. When I talk to somebody in the average public or maybe like a 4-H club night or whatever, I get one of two responses, and I can see it in their faces. There's either the 1,000-yard stare, which means they have no interest in this at all. I may as well move on, but, I'll do a nice job in talking for a few minutes. Or I see the wide-eyed wonder. And the wide-eyed wonder people are the ones that I really want to talk to. Talk to your friends at work, about different things. It's not just, what the Steelers score was last night and things like that, but, other hobbies. We know so little about the people that we work with. We know so little about our fellow club members as to what they do for a 9 to 5. Get to know your members better. Get to know the people you work with better. Get to know people in church or school or whatever.
Right. Build community, essentially.
Right. And amateur radio is just a great way. And I have made so many business contacts over the years by virtue of the two of us being hams. That breaks down all sorts of barriers with things. You have a commonality to talk about that you can build upon with other things too. So there are advantages.
Before we go, Cory, do you have advice that you give to new returning hams to the hobby?
To new hams?
Yeah, to new or returning hams. Somebody that might have gone to sleep for 25 years and came back to ham radio.
Yeah, if you're a returning ham is the same in concept, a lot has changed. You may no longer need to dip the plate and load your antenna,
right.
That sort of thing. Although there's a certain fun in that. There are different modes. There are different ways of looking at stuff. There are different, aspects of things. But that so much is still there. You're still communicating with other people. You're still having fun with it. And I always, whether you're new or you're existing, always talk about the value of a good amateur radio club, the synergy that is there with the other people in the club, the ones that will share information or ask questions. Today's student is tomorrow's mentor. It's amazing how quickly I've seen people go from wanting to know about this topic to a few months later, they're perceived as an expert on that topic. For the new ham, ask questions. Never, ever be afraid to ask questions. And if you're getting exposed to people that look at you when you ask a question and say, what a dumb question that is, go talk to somebody else. It's not a dumb question. It's something you want to know. It's something you want to learn about, and that needs to be encouraged. And if your local radio club isn't doing it and you have a few friends that are frustrated, go start your own club and make that a positive experience and learn together. But it really is about those personal contacts in, one-on-one take you to the remote contacts where it's across the country, the continent, the world.
Cory, I want to thank you so much for joining me on QSO today. I knew that I would get an interesting conversation, and I'm so grateful that you agreed to come on here and talk about your ham radio life and your professional life, and so we touched on a lot of things.
Thank you for the opportunity. It has been a pleasure.
I want to wish you 73. Thank you so much.
73.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Cory. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in WA3UVV in the search box at the top of the page. You can sponsor the transcription of this episode or any of the previous episodes by clicking on the transcription button on every show notes page. The cost is $75 per episode, regardless of the length. We will quickly transcribe the episode and give you credit for your sponsorship. Please send us the call sign of the podcast to make sure that we transcribe what you want. Remember that QSO Today is value for value. Please support our project by making a donation or becoming a listener sponsor today. Use our Amazon link before shopping at Amazon, as we receive a small commission on your Amazon purchases. Subscribe to our mailing lists, both my blog and the podcast, and forward the messages to friends and family who would enjoy QSO Today content. Promote us on social media and give us a 5-star rating and reviews whenever you are asked. QSO Today is available on every podcast player and venue, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and Podcasting 2.0. Get a Podcasting 2.0 player to make it easy to get your next episode as soon as we publish. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.